Hello, welcome to lesson number 7 of our Issues and Debates in Psychology unit. We will be looking at the ideographic and nomothetic approaches today. So let's dive straight into it. Now, the ideographic and nomothetic approach, now these are two words which you aren't probably as familiar with when you're comparing yourself to the others. So even when you've got holism, you can still understand the word whole is there and think of the whole person, or reductionism is to do with reducing, whereas it's a little bit different. So ideographic and nomothetic is around this idea of should we be focusing our attention on making generalizations, so people in general, or we're focusing on the individual. Like, is the aim of the inquiry to produce generalizations against which people can be compared and measured? Or should psychology concern itself with what makes a person unique, the specific rather than the general? And I did talk a little bit about this when we were talking about Ted Bundy, whether we should use him to make generalizations about serial killers or psychopaths, or whether we should be more interested in him as just the individual person that he is. Let's move into the learning objectives. So I want you to focus around this question: should psychology focus its attention on people in general or the individual? So what I want you to do, I want you to understand, and you need to be able to describe and evaluate the ideographic or nomothetic debate. You will need to apply the ideographic nomothetic debate to our psychological approaches. So just like the last lesson, we were looking at applying those to the biological approach, psychodynamic, humanist, etc. And then lastly, I want you to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the nomothetic and ideographic approaches. Here we go. So we'll start off with the ideographic approach. So you could probably guess that it is looking at the individual by the picture. I want you to, this is what it is. It describes the richness of a human experience and gain insight into the person's unique way of viewing the world. So it attempts to explain the nature of the individuals, and it should be studied as a unique entity. Like that's the person who should be studied as a unique entity who has had their own subjective experiences, all the motivations, the drives that's going on, the values. This is all contributed to our own individual development. Apologies for the typo there. So it's all about the individual. So it basically suggests that everyone's unique, and therefore everyone should be studied in an individual way. I'm sure you can guess in what ways would you want to study. Like, think of all the different methods, the scientific methods. Which ones would be best to study an individual? And those are ideographic approaches. So probably the most obvious one would be a case study. Moving on, it is looking at the private, subjective, conscious experiences. Subjective meaning that it's down to the individual. And then lastly, and then looking at these methods under the ideographic approach tend to produce qualitative data that tries to describe the richness and detail of the human experience. And here are some examples. So interviews, when you're going for an interview with a person, particularly an unstructured interview where there's freedom for the discussion to go in new ways and unexpected ways, that would be very much an ideographic research method. The humanistic and Freud's theories are examples of the ideographic approach, and I will talk about why that is later. And it's important to understand that there are no general laws. They're not possible because of chance, free will, and the uniqueness on the individuals. And think we're obviously starting to tap into some of the other debates that are there as well. If we're talking about free will, you can kind of see where we're going here. That takes us over to the determinism free will debate. And it uses, as I mentioned, qualitative data. So what about some examples? Let's have a look at some of the examples around the ideographic approach. So where do we see this in psychology? Well, humanistic psychology is the most obvious one. Rogers and Maslow, I mean, they were, very much on looking at the phenomenon, which is, when it comes to looking at human beings, like what are these strange things that makes humans unique, and so they were only interested in documenting the conscious experience of the individual self. They weren't interested in the broader generalizable things. So they want to know, the unique experience on its own merits. That's what matters, the person, rather than producing these general laws to which you can then apply to everyone. That's not to say you can't do both, but in the case of humanistic, it is very much the individual. You got some other examples. I mean, you've got memory. So case studies on how memory is affected by brain damage. You got the idiographic is complementing the nomothetic because it creates the idiographic can be used to then create general laws. Understanding of individual case studies can bring forth further inquiry and go, look, I've noticed this trend in this particular individual. I've noticed this particular behavior. Let's see if this is then seen in others, and then that causes then the nomothetic side to come in. So the humanistic emphasizes individual, and the psychodynamic uses case studies, and we will talk about one of Freud's cases in particular. So that's the idiographic, all about itself. If we look at the nomothetic, you can tell it is very much the opposite. So the essential aim of the nomothetic is to establish laws and generalizations about people. It is said by Radford and Kirby to have produced 3 general laws in psychology, and these are classifying people into groups. You can establish principles of behavior which can be applied to people in general, and then placing dimensions along which people can be placed, compared or measured, like the IQ scale. So it's all about sort of categorizing people, placing them in these groups. So, what it does is it uses objective knowledge through scientific methods. So it is using a very scientific approach. It's like the reductionist and the holism, in the sense that the reductionist was very scientific. So it provides a benchmark against which people can be compared, classified, and measured. Nomothetic methods are where researchers investigated large groups of people. So we're not looking at individual case studies, or if you do, you're using that to support alongside other evidence to make generalizable laws. But very rarely will you use one case study to make generalizable laws. That's silly. You need to have a larger sample size. The methods under the nomothetic approach are scientific, so they're more interested in quantitative data, and the cognitive, biological, and learning are examples of the nomothetic approach. So let's look at some examples of where this is happening in psychology, and I've got a little kind of comic which places a little bit of fun at the idea of nomothetic and idiographic. So this person saying, it's our God-given right to be free, independent, autonomous, unique, different, to go against the flow. And this person says, hey, who the hell are you to think who you are? Get back in line with the rest. Haha. So Isaac is a classic example. So Isaac developed a very influential model of personality. You may have seen this before, based on the results of a factor analysis of responses on personality questionnaires. So using, he's put out a whole bunch of questionnaires, people have responded, answered, he's sort of using this and going, there's trends here. And he uses that to identify 3 dimensions of personality, which is introversion and extroversion, neuroticism, versatility, or psychoticism, or socialization. So I'm not going to go into that. You probably may have heard it. It's not that important, just so you can kind of clearly see the idea that this person has used information to create generalizable laws, and that's exactly what personality testing is. You try to categorize a person. Some other examples that we could look at is the DSM-5, right across, classifies people into groups. So it looks at people with mood disorders, or etc., etc. Like you've gone all over this already. So establishing principles such as the behaviorist laws of learning, and establishing dimensions. So I've already mentioned ISNEC, and then testing IQ. Puts people into groups. And child development. Bowlby's maternal deprivation theory is nomothetic because you're making generalizable rules about society or more larger society, and so that is then the nomothetic approach. So you've got the ideographic, individual, nomothetic, looking at the broader scale. And I think you've hopefully understood that. Let's take a look then at a particular example and see if you can place it into an ideographic or a nomothetic approach. Now this is embedded in my PowerPoint, as you can see, though there is also a link in the notes description, the notes section of the PowerPoint if you want to go to YouTube, but as it's only a minute, we are just going to watch it here.
Freud's case studies included one of Herbert Graf, or Little Hans. The treatment and findings were published by Freud in 1909 as the analysis of the phobia of a 5-year-old boy. The aim of the study was to report findings of the treatment of Hans, a 5-year-old boy with a strange phobia for horses. The procedure included Hans's father writing a letter to Freud regarding his son's fear. He wrote him several reports, beginning when Hans was 3 up until he was about 5. Freud would write back with suggestions on how to deal with Hans. The first few reports, when Hans was about 3, were regarding his growing interest with his whittler or his penis. It was believed that after his mum threatened to have cut off, Hans developed castration anxiety. At the age of 4, Hans developed a fear of horses biting him. Freud linked the horse to be a symbol of Hans's father, and that Hans was scared of the horse, or his father, and that it would bite or castrate him for his incestuous feelings towards his mother. These feelings towards his mother were revealed through fantasies that he explained to his father, such as one where he was married to his mother and had children, and his father was their grandfather. This supported Freud's phallic stage, where a boy develops an intense sexual love for their mothers. Because of this, he sees his father as a rival and wants to get rid of him. The father, however, is a bigger and far more powerful figure than the young boy, and so the child develops a fear that, seeing him as a rival, his father will castrate him. Freud was attempting to demonstrate that the boy's fear of horses was related to the Oedipus complex. His fear of horses was really a fear towards his father during the resolution of the Oedipus conflict. His fears were resolved after his Oedipus complex was resolved.
Okay, and that is it. So, I have some questions then for you regarding what you have just seen. Now, hopefully you are familiar with Little Hans. If not, I recommend you do some more reading because it was about a minute 30 video, which doesn't really encompass the entire story. So, I want you to identify whether this is an ideographic or a nomothetic approach that Freud is using, and I want you to identify the strengths and weaknesses of this study. Now, I'm sort of going to help prod you in the right direction for answering this. But immediately, if you think of a case study, you should be thinking ideographic. However, Freud is using this to make generalizations about, well, to support his theories, which is then generalizable. So the idea of the phallic stage, and then talking about how this is an example of an Oedipus complex. So it is a bit of both. Identify the strengths and weaknesses. Now, you may not have caught it. So there's a few things. So is that it's heavily biased. Freud himself did not actually, didn't view these. He didn't make these observations. It was Hans's father who did document what happened, and then he would send those in letters to Freud. And the thing is the father was a supporter of Freud and his theories, so you could argue that there's a bit of bias going on. Freud's interpretation of little Hans's behavior is also highly, highly subjective. just because he has a fear of horses, Freud is using this as a way to try and link that, then that's somehow representative to do with his fear of being castrated by his father, and that the horse represents his father. Like, that is a huge interpretation, subjective interpretation. So there's a problem there. It's not really generalizable because it's only one boy from Austria who he's then trying to make generalizations of other children with phobias. It's also unfalsifiable. So one of the biggest problems with Freud in his theories is that they are unfalsifiable, which means they're not scientific. Because if there's a problem, like if somebody isn't following his stages, well, he would say, well, this person here obviously is having issues, so you can't prove him wrong, and that's the problem with Freud. However, Hans was protected from harm during this study, so it was ethical, I suppose, and it was useful. I mean, Freud's study of little Hans and his theories has proved very useful for helping people deal with issues, and it also helped develop psychology into the study of the mind, as opposed to studying reaction times. This is extremely useful research that was carried out, and it did help bring psychology into the limelight, so to speak. So there is some strengths and weaknesses here. So I sort of talked about it myself, because in reality I'll give you guys time in class to talk about it with each other and then write down your answers, but here we are, I'm talking to my computer screen. Right, let's look at the strengths and weaknesses of the nomothetic and idiographic approach. So let's look at the idiographic approach and the strengths. Now there's a few here. You can gain detailed and informative descriptions of behavior using the idiographic approach. It can uncover causes for behavior not identified using nomothetic methods. You can develop a holistic global understanding of the individual, and it can provide a hypothesis for future scientific studies. The case of Henry Molaison, which you probably would have heard from year one studies. It was a widely studied. He was widely studied by psychologists and neuroscientists until I think it was 2008 he died. So it was quite recent. Following, if you know the story, Henry had severe epilepsy, and so there was surgery that happened in the 50s, and what happened was he developed anterograde amnesia, meaning he couldn't commit newly learned facts or events to long-term memory, and memory from events before they actually remained intact. So there was a lot of experimental research that carried out with that wonderful HM. I think it was Corkin who demonstrated how he was able to form long-term memory, procedural memories, procedural memories, that's muscle memory, for simple motor skills and tasks. And this case has proved invaluable in revealing how different types of long-term memory are more resistant to being forgotten, and may be stored in different areas of the brain. So this one case study provided a hypothesis then for future scientific study, and people were interested in going, oh wow, this is fascinating, we need to look into this and look at other people. And as a result, that's exactly what happened. We now have some more generalized information, but we wouldn't have had that if it wasn't for the case study of HM. So those are your positives. Your negatives, you can't generalize it to the wider population. You need the nomothetic side to do that. The methods are subjective, flexible, understandardized. So you can't really reproduce this in the laboratory because it's not standardized when it's come to testing. You can't really predict behavior in this because, well, you're talking like free will and all that kind of stuff. Obviously, when people have free will, they're unpredictable. Your conclusions will often rely on the subjective interpretation of the researcher, thus it's open to bias, so you get that problem there as well. Okay, so your nomothetic. The positives of the nomothetic. is that it is generalizable to the wider population, that your methods are objective and measurable and they can be verified, so you're able to make predictions. It is based on it's enabled psychologists to establish norms of typical behavior, like your IQ, so it gives psychology credibility, and then the processes involved in nomothetic research tend to be more scientific, which mirrors those employed within the natural sciences, which makes it appear to be more scientific and trustworthy. So you can trust nomothetic approaches. Though that's not always the case. There are some problems with that, and that is your generalized laws and principles may not apply to an individual. Just because you have a general law doesn't mean there aren't exceptions, and we have these exceptions all throughout society. All throughout, there are just some people who are a bit different, and that's not to say it's a bad thing. It just means that they're very difficult to place, and so the only real way to do that is through idiographic. It focuses on the general, and because you're looking at the general, you're overlooking the experiences of the minority, and this can be problematic. And this brings us then to our cultural bias as well. If you're focusing on psychology being mainly something of a Western thought, and you're trying to apply the culture from which it comes from, which is Western culture, and you're applying that, for example, intelligence, and you're trying to apply that to particularly the Indigenous Australians, where we saw that there is a distinct difference between the sort of natural intelligence, the ability to observe natural objects is night and day when it comes to your Western Australian children. So that was the example that they showed that the Western Australian children are better at identifying Western objects, and the Indigenous Australian children are better at identifying natural objects like rocks and leaves, whereas the Australian children were better off at identifying like scissors and pens and rulers, which goes to show that, and we were sort of placing one as being more one experience is more valid than the other. That's problematic because we're dismissing the experiences of the minority, which was the Indigenous Australian children. Okay, so people are treated as a series of scores rather than individual people, and their subjective experience is ignored. And we all know that when you treat a person as a number, it's not going to go too well. Think Stanford prison experiment. And lastly, it overlooks the richness of the human experience. So those are your strengths and weaknesses. So we've done what exactly is the idiographic with some examples. What is the nomothetic with examples? We've gone over the strengths and weaknesses, and now we want to look at the approaches. And the first one is the social learning theory, which is nomothetic because it attempts to create general laws of behavior, so vicarious reinforcement. So social learning, nomothetic, and you can say why, because it creates general laws of behavior. I'm gonna fly through this. This is gonna be really quick. So the behaviorist is also nomothetic because you're also creating universal laws. You're saying behavior is in response to a stimulus, and then that you develop associations with the stimulus. So when you hear the school bell, you know that it's time to go. Cognitive is idiographic and nomothetic. It is both. The reason why is it attempts to create general laws of cognitive processing, but it utilizes an idiographic approach with case studies. Piaget is quite famous for using a lot of case studies. And you've got biological, so you've got the nomothetic. It is nomothetic and it creates universal laws as humans share similar psychologies. People, not psychologists, physiologies that can't read today. And then lastly, not lastly, two more. You get the psychodynamic. So it is both. I would say it's probably more idiographic because it involves a lot more case studies. I mean, in particular, Freud used everything he used was case studies. But then again, he is using that to make generalizations. The ego, superego, the stages. It is very much both. maybe even more so nomothetic now I come to think of it, because you've got all the stages, you've got the id-ego, you've got all the different little conflicts that are going on that are akin to all people according to Freud. So maybe it's more so nomothetic, but it definitely is both. And then lastly, you've got the humanistic approach, which is ideographic. I've already talked about this in depth, so no need to go over this too much. Okay, so essay time. Yes, here it is. You need to discuss the ideographic and nomothetic approaches in psychology. Refer to 2 topics you have studied in your answer. Now, I will upload a document to show my homework, which I think will have the answers to this. So I recommend that you just have a go. I mean, this is no different than everything else that you've done. So I do believe when you do your AQA A-level test, you still have to do a 16-mark question on any one of these issues or debates that we've talked about. So you need to actually be able to produce one for every single debate and every single issue. That way, if you've already pre-written one, that can help prepare you for when you actually go to write the actual thing. I will, at some point, put up a video which goes over how to answer a 16-mark question effectively and ways that you can check to make sure that you are getting the full 16 marks. Because there's a way you can go over and do the checklist. But for the meantime, I just want you to have a crack at doing this. You can send it to me if you wish, and I will go over it and I will give you some feedback. But if you're just happy to go off today's notes and simply have a go at answering that question, I'm okay with that as well. So until then, we have only one more lesson left in this series. I believe it's looking at the ethical side of things, which should be quite good. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of chat about animal testing as well, which I'm looking forward to doing. So until then, hope you are all staying safe and healthy, and I will see you in the next lesson.